They thought there was nothing in the void. They were wrong.
We're not alone. It's awake.
If this is the end, we'll show them how we die.
There is no peace in the void, only fear.
The broadcast came at 0400 Terran Standard Time, cutting through every communication channel with a cold, unfeeling precision. The Galactic Council's emblem, a ring of intertwined serpentine forms encircling a white star, hovered ominously above Earth, mirrored in holographic projections across Terran colonies. Admiral Rook Harlow, seated in the dimly lit war room aboard the TFS Resolute, watched as the Council's message unfolded. A hologram of Councillor Vrizail, the insectoid representative of the Thrix Syndicate, filled the room. Its compound eyes gleamed with a disquieting indifference. "Humans of soul," Vrizail began, its mandibles clicking with each syllable. "Your unregulated expansion and military mobilization have violated the Pax Celestia. The Council decrees that you will immediately disarm and cede all frontier territories. Failure to comply will result in corrective action, total subjugation." The message repeated 3 times before the screen went dark. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harlow exhaled slowly, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "They've finally decided we're a threat," he muttered. Beside him, Commander Lian Zhao tightened her grip on the edge of the table. "They're not just trying to stop us, they're making an example." The room's air was thick with simmering defiance. Harlow knew what this meant. The Council had decided humanity's fate long before the ultimatum was sent. This wasn't negotiation. It was the beginning of extermination. "They've made a mistake," Harlow said, standing. "We won't go quietly." Within hours, the news spread across the Sol system and every Terran colony. On Earth, protests erupted. At the Luna shipyards, crews doubled their efforts, constructing warships at a breakneck pace. But as humanity's resolve hardened, shockwaves rippled outward across the Council itself. In the shadowed chambers of the Grand Assembly, dissension brewed. The Ilari delegation, led by Commodore Veshik, grew vocal in their discontent. Veshik's people, once a proud and free species, had suffered centuries of subjugation under the Council's laws. The ultimatum against humanity echoed their own tragic history too closely. "The Council has grown blind with power," Veshik declared during a secret conclave of dissenting races. "Humanity's fate will be ours unless we act." The Vosaran agreed. Their leader, a towering figure named Azrath, spoke in his people's cold, calculating tone. "The Council's actions are illogical. They aim to provoke war, not prevent it." The alliance that formed in that room was fragile but resolute. Humanity would not stand alone. Veshik led the Ilari fleet away from their Council holdings, defecting to join humanity. The Vosaran, though fewer in number, offered their unmatched tactical brilliance and organic warships engineered to adapt to any battlefield. Harlow met Veshik aboard the Resolute weeks later in the shadow of the newly christened Terran flagship TFS Dawnbringer. Veshik's amphibious bioluminescent form shimmered faintly in the sterile light. Despite his alien appearance, his grim determination was unmistakable. "We share a common enemy," Veshik said in his deep, resonant voice. "But the Council will not tolerate our defiance. They will come with their full strength." Harlow nodded. "Then we'll need a place to hide while we build our strength. A place they won't think to look." The answer was the Lartoon Expanse, a graveyard of broken moons and derelict stations orbiting a dying star. It was a sector long abandoned by the Council, known for its navigational hazards and impenetrable nebulae. It was the perfect place to hide. Yet from the moment the fleet began establishing their base of operations, strange occurrences began to unfold. Ships reported bizarre gravitational distortions that defied physics. Star maps shifted inexplicably, as though the very void itself were rearranging. During one recon patrol, a Ilari scout ship returned with its crew in a catatonic state. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Medics found no biological cause. It was as if something had stolen their minds and left their bodies behind. Tensions ran high. Whispers spread like wildfire through the fleet. Stories of vanished ships, strange voices heard over comms, and impossible shadows flickering on sensor readouts. Harlow called an emergency meeting in the fleet's war room, a massive hollowed-out deck aboard the Dawnbringer lined with holographic displays. The gathered leaders, human, Ilari, and Vosaran, wore grim expressions. "We came here to build a resistance," Harlow began, his voice steady but strained. "But something out there doesn't want us here." Veshik's bioluminescent skin dimmed, a sign of concern. "The Lartoon Expanse is ancient, older than the Council itself. The Ilari have legends of worlds consumed by living darkness, hungers that sleep between stars. Perhaps we've disturbed something that was meant to remain forgotten." Zhao stepped forward. "Legends or not, we can't abandon the Expanse. Without this base, we're defenseless." The room fell silent until Asrath's clicking voice cut through. "Then we must understand what we're facing. If it's a foe that can be destroyed, we will destroy it. If not, we must find a way to contain it." Harlow nodded, though unease settled like lead in his gut. He knew the void was indifferent to ambition or desperation. But this felt like something worse, a place that had been abandoned for a reason. As the meeting adjourned, Harlow lingered at the edge of the observation deck. He stared out at the swirling nebulae and the distant glint of dead worlds. He felt a chill, not fear of the Council, nor even of war. It was the feeling of being watched by something ancient, something that should not have been awake. Lieutenant Orlan Reyes watched the endless darkness outside the viewport of the TFS Ardent. The stars seemed distant and cold, blurred by the swirling dust of the Lartoon Expanse. Even the light from the dying star at the system's center was faint and sickly, casting long, jagged shadows across the reinforced hull. The Ardent's mission was straightforward: scout potential safe zones and chart navigable routes for fleet movements deeper into the Expanse. It should have been routine, but nothing about the Expanse felt routine. Reyes had led enough missions to recognize when something was wrong. The stillness out here felt too deliberate, like the quiet between heartbeats before something terrible. "Approaching planetoid CX-17, reported Ensign Hale from the helm. "Initial scans show atmospheric interference. Readings are inconclusive." Reyes frowned and leaned forward. The holographic map of CX-17 flickered on the command display. An irregular, jagged world wrapped in a thin, hazy atmosphere. The planet's surface was marred by ridges and formations that looked almost like open wounds. "Send a pulse scan," Reyes ordered. "We need detailed topography before sending a team down." Hale complied, launching a wave of electromagnetic pulses toward the planet. The data that returned made the room fall silent. There were structures down there, organic, massive, and pulsing, faintly with energy signatures. They formed a grotesque lattice across the planet's surface. Commander Sarek, the Ilari second in command, stepped forward. His bioluminescent markings flared in alarm. "Those formations, they resemble biocolonies from our early wars, a network of living matter. But this is different." Reyes knew what Sarek was implying. The Ilari were renowned for their expertise in bioengineering. If this was something that disturbed Sarek, it wasn't natural, and yet protocol demanded investigation. "Prep the lander," Reyes said grimly. "We need answers." The landing team consisted of 5 members: Reyes, Sarek, Corporal Lang, Engineer Harlow, and Sergeant Kyle. The descent to the planet was rough, buffeted by turbulence from the strange atmospheric interference. The mist enveloped them, thick and almost oily against the lander's viewport. When the lander touched down, Reyes's calm crackled. "Stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into." The surface was uneven and coarse, like dried flesh stretched over a skeletal framework. Reyes crouched and ran his hand over the ground. It was hard but pliant, like cartilage beneath a thin layer of bone. The structures that loomed around them stretched high into the haze, resembling massive, jagged spines. They pulsed faintly, emitting a sickly bioluminescence. Lang scanned one of the spines with his multi-tool. The composition is organic, but it's fused with metallic traces. It's alive, but reinforced. "That's not possible," Kyle muttered, gripping his plasma rifle tighter. Reyes felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He stared up at the closest structure, a massive rib-like column that seemed to tremble in the thin air. Then it moved. The surface split open with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a mass of writhing tendrils. They lashed out, impossibly fast. Lang barely had time to scream before the tendrils wrapped around him, lifting him into the air. His body convulsed as the tendrils pierced his armor, burrowing into his flesh. His screams turned into gurgles as his skin began to bubble and shift. "Fire!" Reyes shouted, but even as their plasma rounds scorched the tendrils, the creature did not release Lang. Instead, his form was dragged into the column itself, absorbed into its pulsating mass. Reyes stumbled back, horror clawing at his mind. "Fall back! Get to the lander, now!" The team turned and ran, but the ground shifted beneath their feet, as though something vast and alive was stirring beneath the surface. The spines swayed and groaned like ancient titans waking from slumber. Sarek's voice was sharp over the comms. The biomass is expanding. The entire surface is reacting to us. Harlow tripped as the ground cracked open beneath him. Tendrils shot upward, wrapping around his legs and dragging him down. Kale fired relentlessly, severing the tendrils, but more emerged, writhing like serpents. Harlow's screams echoed as he was pulled into the widening fissure, disappearing into the darkness. Reyes grabbed Kale's shoulder and pulled him forward. "We can't save him! Move!" The lander was in sight, its lights glowing faintly through the haze. The path ahead was unstable, the ground quivering with life. As they ran, the column they'd first approached collapsed with a deafening roar, sending fragments of bone-like debris raining down. Smaller, sinewy forms emerged from the wreckage, humanoid shapes that twitched and staggered, their bodies malformed and unfinished. They were composed of the same organic matter, their hollow eyes glowing with faint, unnatural light. Kale stopped and raised his rifle, his breathing ragged. "Are those—" "They're not human anymore," Reyes shouted. "Don't hesitate. Shoot!" The shapes surged forward, their movements jerky but fast. Plasma fire lit the mist, cutting through the creatures, but for every one that fell, 2 more emerged from the fog. Sarek's claws raked through one abomination, but its body reformed around the wound, as though it was more liquid than solid. Reyes reached the lander first, slamming his hand on the control panel to open the hatch. "Inside now!" Sarek and Kale stumbled aboard as more tendrils erupted from the ground, grasping for the ship's hull. Reyes hit the emergency ignition sequence, and the lander's engines roared to life. The tendrils writhed in the heat, blackening and recoiling as the ship lifted off. As they ascended, Reyes turned to Kale, and his blood ran cold. Kale was convulsing, his veins bulging unnaturally beneath his skin. His eyes rolled back, and a thick, viscous fluid leaked from his mouth. His armor split as growths of bone and sinew sprouted from his spine. Reyes lunged forward, pulling Sarek back. "Get away from him!" Kyle's body twisted unnaturally, his spine arching as the infection spread. Reyes reached for his sidearm, tears burning his eyes. "I'm sorry." The gunshot echoed through the cabin, and Kyle's body slumped to the floor, twitching once before falling still. Sarek's bioluminescence dimmed with grief. "It's in the air. This place. It's a trap." Reyes gritted his teeth, trying to block out the memory of Kale's scream. "We have to warn the fleet." The lander pierced through the atmosphere and re-entered orbit, hurtling toward the TFS Ardent. Reyes stared at the planet below, its surface rippling like a living, breathing thing. Something ancient had awakened, and they had barely escaped its grasp. The TFS Ardent drifted silently in orbit above the Larton expanse, a dark silhouette against the dying star's pale glow. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss, but inside, hell had already taken root. Lieutenant Orlane Reyes stumbled out of the lander, blood staining his uniform, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. The docking bay crew swarmed the lander, their questions coming in waves, but Reyes could barely form coherent answers. "Lock this deck down," he barked, his voice raw. "No one enters until we're decontaminated." The medics carried Sarek away, unconscious and pale, his bioluminescent markings dulling as his body trembled from unseen trauma. Kael's body, wrapped hastily in a containment shroud, was placed on an anti-grav stretcher. Reyes didn't watch as they took it away. He couldn't. The sound of Kael's final convulsions still echoed in his ears. Minutes turned to hours as Reyes sat in the med bay, staring at nothing. His mind replayed the events on CX-17 over and over. The spines, the writhing mass, the way the planet itself had seemed alive. But the moment that haunted him most was Kyle. He could still see the way his friend's body had twisted, the grotesque shapes that had erupted from his skin, as though his very bones had betrayed him. Dr. Hensley approached, her face grim. "Lieutenant, we ran every test we have. There's nothing, no parasite, no toxin, no pathogen that we can detect." Reyes clenched his fists. "You're saying he just transformed for no reason?" "No," Hensley said quietly. "I'm saying something changed him at a level we can't comprehend." The intercom crackled before Reyes could respond. "Bridge to Reyes. We need you immediately. There's a situation." Reyes shot Hensley a glance before heading for the lift, dread pooling in his gut. When he arrived on the bridge, the tension was palpable. Commander Dren looked pale as he pointed to the main viewport. "It's the Ardent," he whispered. Reyes followed his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. The ship's hull was changing. Sections of the external plating bulged unnaturally, as if something beneath the metal was pushing outward. The sleek, reinforced corridors he knew so well now appeared swollen, lined with veins of blackened material that pulsed like arteries. The ship itself was becoming organic. "What the hell is happening?" Reyes asked. A sensor officer looked up, her face pale with terror. "It started 15 minutes ago. Bioorganic growths, like what you described on the planet, have appeared all over the lower decks. We've lost contact with engineering and with the medical bay." Reyes felt ice slide down his spine. "Sarek." He sprinted out of the bridge, shouting orders to the security teams as he made his way to the medbay. The moment he stepped inside, he knew he was too late. The walls were breathing. The sterile white panels had become a fleshy red, slick with fluid. The biobeds were now cocoons, covered in sinewy strands that pulsed faintly. One of the cocoons burst open as Reyes approached. A figure stumbled out, twisted, deformed. Sarek, or what was left of him. Sarek's luminous skin was gone, replaced with translucent flesh that writhed with veins. His limbs had elongated unnaturally, and his eyes were milky white. His mouth opened, but what came out wasn't a voice. It was a wet, rasping sound, like a dying breath stretched into eternity. Reyes raised his plasma pistol. "Sarek, I'm sorry." The thing that had been Sarek lunged. Reyes fired. The blast tore through its chest, but it didn't fall. The wound closed, sinew knitting together in seconds. "Sarek is gone," Reyes shouted over his comm. "The infection, whatever it is, it's turning them into something else. We need to purge the lower decks." "Understood," Dren's voice crackled. "Evacuating non-combatants now." But the ship was already sealing its fate. Alarms blared across the Ardent as the infection spread. Doors fused shut with bone-like growths. Control panels oozed viscous fluids as tendrils coiled through the wiring, embedding themselves in the ship's nervous system. What had been cold machinery was becoming something alive. Teams of soldiers fought to contain the outbreak, but it was futile. Their plasma rifles dismembered the infected, but the bodies reformed. Worse, some of the infected retained fragments of their former minds. Reyes could hear their screams over the comm channels, the desperate pleas of men and women who were still conscious, trapped inside their own mutating flesh. "Please, someone help me. I don't want to die like this." Their cries twisted into inhuman screeches as their bodies gave way to the infection. Reyes staggered into the armory, sweat dripping down his face as he keyed in the emergency override for the incendiary units. If plasma didn't work, fire might. He grabbed a flamethrower and gathered what remained of his team. "The med bay is lost," Reyes said. "The infection is heading for engineering. If it reaches the reactor core, we're all dead." He led the charge down the ruined corridor, the walls pulsing around them like intestines. One of the soldiers gagged as a sickly, sweet smell filled the air. They reached the main engineering deck and stopped cold. The reactor chamber had transformed into a grotesque cathedral of flesh and bone. Organic growths spiraled up the walls, forming vast, rib-like arches. Tendrils dripped from the ceiling, fusing into the reactor itself. At the center was a mass of writhing limbs and heads, dozens of fused bodies, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Reyes took a step forward, his breath shallow. He recognized some of the faces. Harlow, Lang, Sarek. Their eyes followed him, mouths opening in a grotesque, voiceless chorus. "Burn it," Reyes whispered. The flamethrowers roared to life, bathing the room in searing fire. The flesh writhed and shrieked as it burned, the air filling with the smell of charred meat. The reactor trembled, but the infection didn't retreat. It fought back. Tendrils lashed out, spearing two soldiers and dragging them into the burning mass. Reyes screamed orders, trying to keep his team together, but it was too late. The infection was too vast, too fast. With his remaining strength, Reyes grabbed a plasma detonator from his belt and activated it. The countdown began to hum ominously. He turned to the last surviving soldier, a terrified young man named Voss. "Get to the escape pod," Reyes said. "What about you?" Voss's voice cracked with fear. "I'm finishing this." Reyes shoved Voss toward the exit. "Go." As Voss ran, Reyes stared into the writhing mass one last time. It almost seemed aware. The faces stared at him, pleading. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then the detonator's timer hit 0. The explosion tore through the TFS Ardent, a blinding fireball that consumed the infection, and Reyes with it. In the distant void, the remaining fleet watched as the Ardent's wreckage burned in silence. But in that silence, there was no comfort, only the lingering dread that the infection wasn't truly gone, and that something far worse had only just begun. The remains of the Terran Fleet hung in orbit over Varnok's rift, battle-scarred and diminished. The massive nebula stretched out before them, a churning storm of gas and debris, illuminated by the dim, dying light of a red dwarf star. Every vessel that still had a working engine had gathered here. There was nowhere else left to run. Admiral Rook Harlow stood on the observation deck of the TFS Dawnbringer, the flagship of what little remained of humanity's resistance. The massive warship had survived countless battles, but now even its reinforced plating was scorched and fractured. Crews worked tirelessly to repair the damage, though everyone knew the truth. They were living on borrowed time. Behind Harlow, Commander Lian Zhao spoke quietly. No response from the Council. Harlow nodded, his face grim. They had sent a final, desperate plea for aid. Not just for humanity, but for every species in the galaxy. If the infection wasn't stopped here, it would spread like wildfire across the stars. Yet the Council had remained silent, watching from their distant seats of power, as the Terran Fleet was left to face oblivion alone. "They'll wait until we're ashes," Harlow muttered, "and by then it'll be too late." Zhao hesitated. "Sir, do you think it's still out there? After the Ardent? After Reyes?" Harlow's jaw clenched at the name. Reyes had been a good man, a symbol of everything humanity fought for. The thought of what happened to him still gnawed at Harlow's heart. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. "It's out there," he said quietly, "waiting for us to break." A chime sounded through the bridge. "Admiral," an officer called, "we're detecting something at the edge of the rift." Harlow turned to the central holodisplay, where a massive shape emerged from the swirling mists, a form so large that it defied comprehension. It was the infection, but it had changed. No longer a mass of disparate, fused bodies. It had become something unified, something monstrous. The bioorganic structure pulsed with alien light, vast tendrils stretching miles across the void, like the limbs of some impossible god. The bridge fell silent as the creature unfurled, its massive body shimmering with the remnants of absorbed ships and lives. At its core, a cluster of faint, glowing orbs pulsed rhythmically. They resembled beating hearts, and within them, imprisoned memories, fragments of countless minds it had consumed. Zhao's voice was hoarse. "Dear God, it's using them." Harlow stared at the grotesque construct, fury and grief boiling in his chest. He could almost hear the voices of the dead, Reyes, Kyle, Sarek, all of them trapped inside that thing, calling out for release. He took a slow breath and straightened. "Send the order to the fleet. All remaining ships form a defensive line. We hold the line here until the last breath." Zhao nodded, though her eyes glistened. "Yes, sir." Across the fleet, battered ships fell into formation. Human warships and alien defectors stood shoulder to shoulder. Some vessels had lost entire decks, others had scavenged makeshift weapons, but none retreated. They all knew what was coming, and they knew this was their end. The creature began to move, slowly at first, then accelerating. Entire fragments of derelict vessels fused into its body, jettisoned like bone shrapnel missiles. The front line was shredded as explosions ripped through the void. Human frigates vanished in fireballs as smaller, sinewy bioships split off from the main mass, swarming the defenders like hornets. Harlow gripped the command rail. "Target its core! Full power to the rail cannons!" The Dawnbringer's massive guns fired, twin streaks of blue plasma tearing across the void. The shots slammed into the central mass, sending shockwaves across its surface. For a moment it writhed, but then it stabilized, regenerating at a terrifying speed. Zhao's voice cracked with desperation. It's healing faster than we can damage it. We have to buy time, Harlow growled. Get me reactor control. The display flickered as the chief engineer appeared, covered in soot. Sir? Harlow's voice was steady. Prepare the stellar annihilator. We're detonating it manually. The engineer froze. Sir, if we do that... I know, Harlow interrupted. Just do it. The stellar annihilator was a last resort, a prototype capable of collapsing into a miniature star. If detonated inside the heart of the creature, it could destroy the infection entirely. But the blast would also consume the entire fleet. Zhao stared at him, wide-eyed. You can't ask them to... Rook. Harlow's expression softened for a moment, just enough to show the man beneath the Admiral. I'm not asking. He pressed the fleet-wide calm button. His voice was calm, resolute. All ships, this is Admiral Harlow. The silence was absolute. Across the fleet, soldiers and civilians alike stopped what they were doing to listen. We've fought hard. We've given everything, and now we stand at the end. I won't lie to you, there's no miracle coming. The Council has abandoned us, but we are not alone. We stand together as humans, Ilari, Vosaran, as one people. Today we don't fight for survival, we fight for each other, for every life this thing has taken, for Earth, for our worlds, for the fallen. He paused, his voice catching for the briefest moment. We will make them remember our name. We will make them remember that even at the end of all things, we did not break. A chorus of acknowledgments came through the calm, some defiant, some tearful, but all resolute. The Dawnbringer charged forward, leading the fleet into the heart of the creature. Plasma fire and ion bursts lit the void in a desperate storm of light. Smaller ships rammed bioships head-on, detonating their cores in brilliant flashes. The creature writhed as the defenders sacrificed themselves one by one, but still it pressed forward. As the Dawnbringer neared the creature's core, the ship's hull began to buckle. Fleshy tendrils wrapped around the ship, trying to crush it. The bridge shook violently, consoles sparking and lights flickering. Harlow rose from his chair, battered but unbroken. He turned to Zhao. It's been an honor. Tears streamed down Zhao's face, but she nodded. You too. Harlow slammed his hand down on the detonator. The Dawnbringer's core ignited, a brilliant sphere of white-hot plasma expanding outward. The shockwave consumed the creature, its body disintegrating in waves of burning light. The hearts at its core burst like overripe fruit, their imprisoned memories finally freed. The explosion spread outward, swallowing the remaining ships, the rift, and the infection in a final cataclysmic blaze. In the silence that followed, the stars seemed to hold their breath. The rift was gone. The fleet was gone. But so too was the infection. When word finally reached the Council, they were met not with celebration, but silence. Humanity was gone, but in its sacrifice, it had shown the galaxy something the Council could not contain. The whispers began, carried across the stars by survivors and defectors, stories of a doomed fleet that defied extinction, of humanity's last stand. And though the Terran Fleet was gone, its memory became a rallying cry for oppressed worlds. In the end, humanity did not survive, but they became something more. They became legend,